Tonight I haven't done a handout, partly for technical issues, but also because I've had to change my lesson that I was originally going to present. Got to try and condense some things, and I gave up with that idea because I can't condense this any more than we've already done. So I'd rather go at the same pace and field more questions from you. I feel that we're getting to a point of this study where maybe that's prudent. You have more questions, and I'm happy to try and field those. I've called lesson 8 of the Afterlife series the long sleep of the dead. The long sleep of the dead. Last lesson we looked at the state of the dead in Hades, in Sheol. Where are they? What is Hades? What is Sheol? What is Tartarus? What is Gehenna? I handed out a sheet with word studies of all those terms. And I think one of the things we concluded was, because of what Peter, how he used a passage in the Sermon on Pentecost, Psalm 16:10, which is messianic, saying that the Lord's body would not see corruption. And obviously he wasn't referring to David, because David's tomb was still there in Jerusalem, and if you opened it up, there'd be a pile of dust that used to be David's body and bones. But when he used that quote in the Old Testament, the term is Sheol that's used, and in the New Testament version that Peter preaches, he uses the term Hades. So one thing we can draw from that is that Hades and Sheol are synonymous. Okay, they are, for all intents and purposes, the same thing. So that's kind of handy to know. I said something about the reason, one of the main reasons for confusion over a number of passages, and especially one we're going to come to, if not this week, certainly next week, is the misuse of the translation of the term Hades as hell, when Jesus gave hell a specific term, Gehenna, named after, if you remember, a valley that was on the southwest side of Jerusalem. Jerusalem's up on a high mount, and they used to throw their trash and dead animals, carcasses, and even dead criminals that they had put to death. They slung them into that valley there, and it was kind of a never-ending fires of burning of waste down there, and that place was used because originally, back in the time of King Ahaz and King Manasseh, and maybe some others, but certainly those two, they were both kings who were guilty of passing their own sons through the fire and offering them as a sacrifice to the god Milcom, who was one of the gods of I think it was the Moabites, it may have been the Midianites, the different names given for the same god, depending on which text you're in. And because that was such a despicable sin, an abomination in God's eyes, it kind of made that place forever sort of, untouchable in the eyes of the Jews. Remember, by the time we get to Jesus, the one thing that Israel is not struggling with as much as it did in the Old Testament is what? What are they not? I mean, in the Old Testament, they constantly had problems with idolatry, didn't they? But not so much when we get to the time of Jesus. Undoubtedly, there was some going on, but as a rule, Israel's no longer worshipping the idols of the nations around them. Okay, that doesn't mean they haven't got problems, but that idolatry doesn't seem to figure as prevalent as it used to. We looked at a number of passages last time that seem to confirm that there's no activity whatsoever that takes place in Hades. We looked at let's look at one passage, Ecclesiastes 9. Just Dale's just done a sermon series on this book. Ecclesiastes 9 verses 5 and 6 tell us that the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing at all. Never again will they have any part in anything that happens under the sun. So they will never be involved in anything, never have any influence over what goes on earth. And verse 10 seems to underline that in Sheol, where all are going, there is neither working, nor planning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom. And if those things are not there, that would kind of constrain activity, wouldn't it? If there's no knowledge, no wisdom, it kind of sounds like everybody down there is in some kind of coma or vegetative state and not able to partake in anything, okay, or experience anything. Now, admittedly, that comes from the writer of Ecclesiastes, so we have to be somewhat careful of context, but it does seem that overall the context is reliable there. Of all the words that are used in Scripture to describe the activity of the dead, by far the most common use that you'll see in the Old Testament and in the New is the word sleep. The word sleep. Two words are used interchangeably, even by Jesus himself in the New Testament, and both are used euphemistically, like a euphemism, or as a metaphor to describe the sleep of the dead. The first word is the word kathudo. If you want to look it up in Strong's or in Thayer's concordance, the number, Strong's number is 2518. If you turn to Matthew chapter 9, which is Matthew's account of, is it Jairus' daughter? Yes, it is. Jairus' daughter, that account. Jesus says, while he was saying these things to them, he was talking about fasting, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live. And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. And behold, you have the woman with the hemophilia, the discharge of blood that had been going on for years. But Jesus turned and, where is it? Yes, verse 24, he said, to the professional mourners that were outside of this man's house, he said, go away, for the girl is not dead but sleeping. The Jews, like they do today in a lot of those nations in the Middle East, you have people who are professional mourners. They'll stand outside the house wailing and doing all kinds of stuff to let it be known that someone has died. And he says, go away. The girl's not dead, but sleeping. Now, why would Jesus say that? Why would he use that term? They laughed at him, ridiculed him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went throughout the district. Well, that word there that Jesus uses is this kathudo word. And there's another word that is used, and it's the word koimeomai. We get an English term from that. Can you think what it might be? Koimeomai. How about a coma? Yeah. How about someone who's comatose? If they're comatose, what are they? Yeah, I mean, you ain't waking them up, are you? They are in deep sleep, deep. Okay, so that's used by Luke in Acts 7:60 to describe the state that Stephen went into whilst he was being stoned outside of Jerusalem by the Sanhedrin. Let's just find that, Acts 7:60. And falling to his knees, Stephen cried out with a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And when he had said this, he fell asleep. Now, I don't know about you, but that kind of seems a bit strange, doesn't it? Of all the terms it could have used, the guy's being stoned. That means he's been pummeled with rocks and boulders. Okay, he's probably been cast into a pit so that when they throw the rocks in, they're guaranteed to hit him. All right. And like, you know, we're not talking little pebbles here. We're talking big boulders. I don't know about you, but if I was being stoned, would you be thinking of going to sleep? Not really. So it seems a kind of strange term, especially when you consider Luke's medical background. That's a very strange term for him to use, isn't it? Wouldn't he say something like he went unconscious or he died? Sleep? And the way that he says it, he fell asleep, it's as if no pain. He just passed. It was taken from him, the pain was. And so that kind of rings bells in my head and makes me sort of think, I need to do a bit more study on this. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there's something lies back at that, because it's an interesting term for a doctor to use. It's not hard to see why the word sleep would be used, perhaps, because when most people die, if you've ever been to a visitation, they do kind of look like they're sleeping, don't they? Or maybe they're in a coma. So in that sense, it would be an apt description. But having said that, the connection between sleep and Sheol seems to be much more than just simple imagery. David uses that imagery a lot in the Psalms. In Psalms 13 and verse 3, David laments of his own life and says, "Consider and answer me, O Lord, my God, light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death." So there you have David using that term 1,000 years before Christ. And as he considers the wonders of God's intimacy in every part of his life in Psalm 139, verses 7 and 8, he says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there also." So you can't get away from God, from his spirit. But it's interesting that he uses that term, "if I make my bed in Sheol." So the analogy again is somewhere to sleep. Concerning David's death, in Acts 13, when Paul's preaching at the synagogue in Antioch, he says in verse 36, "For David, King David, after he had served the counsel or the purpose of God in his own generation, what did he do? He fell asleep and was laid with his fathers and saw corruption." And he's referring to that passage again that I was talking about earlier, Psalm 16:10. David's body saw corruption, but notice, he fell asleep and was laid with his fathers. So is this sleep thing, is it merely a euphemism? Well, maybe, but the choice of words is definitely interesting, since Paul could have just simply said there, couldn't he, that after he's served God's purposes in his generation, he died. Why didn't he say that? Well, maybe because he's trying to show us something about what happens after the death of the physical body. Do you think it could be possible that we're being told something more in these passages about the nature of death. Look at Isaiah 57. Isaiah 57. Isaiah says that the righteous man, in verse 1, enters into peace, which I've said before. When you see that word peace, it's a covenant term. Peace is something that can only be established between yourself and God when you're in covenant with Him. Peace is not there to be enjoyed by people who are not in covenant with God, because they are at enmity with God. He enters into peace, and they, in brackets the righteous, says, rest in their beds who walk in their uprightness. Now that's the ESV. The NIV, I kind of like the way the NIV puts this. They do a good job of the translation. The NIV puts it this way. It says, those who walk uprightly enter into peace. They find rest as they lie in death. And that really is what the passage is saying. They find rest as they lie in death. I think that's interesting because of something I'll come to later on. So you might want to remember that passage. When we talk about consciousness and unconsciousness, I think the way that we die and the way that we enter Hades, our soul, I think if we're right with God, I think there is rest. I think it's a restful sleep that we enter into, albeit unconscious, but subconsciously, nothing to worry about. Yeah. What about if you're not right with God when you die, when you breathe your last breath and your soul then departs to Hades and you're not right with God? Do you think that's a restful sleep that you enter into? I believe it's a sleep, but I don't think it's a restful sleep. The Hebrew writer says it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Kind of think his context there is the expectation of judgment. We mentioned that just before in the earlier verse, but it seems to me that there's a sleep that's a bit more dreadful, dreading what's coming. So, but sleep nonetheless. So I like the NIV's translation of Isaiah 57 verse 2. We might want to remember this in the context of Job 14:12. I've quoted that a number of times. Job says, so man lies down and does not rise till the heavens are no more. Men will not awaken or be roused from their sleep. And I want to note that word roused there. Who served in the forces and did basic training in the billets? Did you ever get roused? What's réveillé or réveillé? It's French term, isn't it?
Wake up.
Is that the rousing at 5 o'clock in the morning?
Get you up about 4:30.
4:30.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was it the gentle? You know, here's a cup of mug of coffee. And,
Yeah, really. Yeah.
no, not quite.
Yeah, turbo swings you around and they kiss you on the forehead.
Oh, is that right?
Okay. In the Air Force.
You need to come and see me later. Okay. It certainly seems that the sleep referred to is continuous. If you listen to Job there, until the heavens are no more. So what does it appear the dead are doing in Sheol? Sleeping. That's it. Job 3:13. For now I would be lying down in peace. I would be asleep and at rest, Job says. And then verse 17, he says, there the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. So what do we have in all of these? And I could go to many, many more Old Testament quotations. What do we have here? It certainly looks like a linguistic super metaphor mixed with factual reality, I think. What does Paul have to say about the dead? He's the writer of most of the letters in the New Testament. What does he say about the dead? Well, we've got two passages, one that we've already been to in 1 Corinthians 15 that are really informative about the afterlife, and then also 1 Thessalonians 4 and chapter 5. And he consistently uses the term sleep or sleeping to describe those who've passed from this physical life throughout those passages and others. For example, 1 Thessalonians 4:13, he starts by saying, brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be ignorant about those who are asleep. Why didn't he say those who are dead? So that you will not grieve as others do who have no hope. And then in verse 14, he says, we believe that Jesus will bring with him to heaven those who have fallen asleep. And what he means there is fallen asleep in Christ, in him.
This is dead in Christ.
Well, if you, yeah.
The dead in Christ shall rise.
The dead in Christ shall rise. That may be a translation that's put it that way. But there are a lot that just talk about those who are asleep in him. It's the word kormeo in the Greek. 1 Corinthians 15:51, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Basically meaning that when Christ comes back, there'll be some faithful still alive on this earth who haven't died. Okay, so we won't all go to sleep, fall asleep, but we are all going to be changed when he returns. We're all going to be given that new spiritual body. Jesus, he says, died for us so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live with him forever. And one thing that you'll notice when you look at all these passages is that that verb sleep is always in the present tense. And what does the present tense tell us? What does the present tense tell us? It's still happening now. They were asleep when this was written 2,000 years ago. They're still asleep now. It's a continuous activity. Okay, so that's worth noting as well, because he could have used different tenses which would have restricted that. Well, if that term sleep is being used in the sense of a euphemism, then I think we're limiting it too much. I think there's more to it than that. All these deceased are sleeping right now in Hades, Sheol. Well, we've looked at the Old Testament writers, we've looked at Paul. What about Jesus? What does Jesus say on the subject? What word of choice does he use to describe those who are physically deceased? What do you think? When Jesus uses the word sleep to describe what the dead are doing, he uses the term not so much as a metaphor, but as a teachable moment. Was that Rush Limbaugh who coined that phrase? A teachable moment. And we'll go back to Jairus' daughter in Mark's account, Mark 5:39. Even though those professional mourners derided him when he said that Jairus' daughter was just asleep, merely asleep, not dead, what Jesus was really doing was showing them that death is not the cessation of the whole person, but merely the physical body. Isn't Jesus saying, sure, her body's dead, but her soul is very much alive and sleeping? In Luke's account of this miracle, in Luke 8:55, when Jesus says to the dead 12-year-old girl, Talitha Kumi, which means child arise, Note that Luke then says, her spirit returned to her. The others don't go into that detail, but Luke does, and I think that's very helpful. The word there, spirit, is the word pneuma in the Greek that he uses. And that's a telling statement because it looks like Jesus is commanding her soul to return to her body and revitalize her. That's what he's basically saying. And then we have John chapter 11, the occasion of Lazarus, his friend. John 11 through 14, Jesus tells his disciples, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going to wake him up. And his disciples replied, Lord, if he's asleep, surely he'll get better, won't he? But Jesus, John says, had been speaking of his death. But his disciples thought he was referring to natural sleep. That's what John says there. So that provides some useful information to us. So then Jesus plainly says, Lazarus is dead. So what has John just told us that Jesus has shown his disciples? What's the teachable moment there? He just equated death with sleep, didn't he? He did it right there in that passage. So I find that very helpful. I don't know about you. I think Jesus is taking advantage of another teachable moment. Is he not using this miracle to teach them and to teach you and me something important about the great mystery of man's mortality? What else could Jesus have meant when he claimed that God was still the God of Abraham, still the God of Isaac, still the God of Jacob in Luke 20? He is not the God of the dead, Jesus says, but of the living. For to God, all are alive. That's a mind-blowing statement, isn't it? Well, unless you've been in some of our classes. But it makes a bit more sense, doesn't it? In the context of what we're talking about. No, not natural sleep, but rather the sleep of the only part of the person that survives natural death. The sleep of the soul. The sleep of the soul. Well, we're getting to the crux time. Either the dead are extinct, or somewhere, somehow, God has arranged for the soul of everyone who's ever lived and died to live on. What's it to be? If you believe in God, you must be persuaded that man is more than just an animal. Otherwise, this doesn't make sense. I hope by now that you see that we're well beyond that point. We're more at the point of deciding whether the biblical record informs us that disembodied soul's continuous existence is either conscious or unconscious, which is what I've just been talking about. If it's the soul, well, first of all, what is the soul? Let's remind ourselves of some things we've looked at earlier. Is the soul physical or spiritual, isn't it? So if the soul is spirit, I mean, you can't go to any hospital for a soulectomy, can you? Because the surgeon wouldn't know where to start looking, would he? Even if you said, well, check the heart out, because the Bible says it's the heart, or maybe the bowels. Well, that'd be a messy business, wouldn't it? Plenty of that to go through, but you ain't going to find the soul there because it's spirit. Okay. If God's going to put the soul somewhere for safekeeping, where is he going to put it? Because it's not in the physical body, it's not in the physical realm anymore. So where
is Hades, or what is Hades?
A holding pattern.
A holding pattern? What, like the planes over Heathrow?
It's a spiritual place.
It's
where
got to
you
be a
sleep.
spiritual place, hasn't it? And what do we know about things spiritual, like God? Where God is in heaven, has he got a clock on the wall? Has he got a diary?
Is God in Hades?
Hmm?
Is God in Hades?
Well, David seemed to think he was everywhere, didn't he? Couldn't get away from him. But it's interesting, and if it's in the spiritual realm, time isn't involved with Hades. Now, that doesn't stop God from waking everybody up one day, does it? But for the purposes of our study here, Hades is a spiritual realm where the dead's souls go, okay? And if it's not subject to time, it's a state, isn't it? It's a state of existence rather than a place of existence. Does that compute? Does that make sense? If it doesn't, please tell me and I'll try and explain it another way. Yeah.
When Jesus went to paradise,
Uh-huh.
okay, took the thief with him. So it's a place, a holding place for the soul.
Yeah, but if it's outside of time,
So it's gotta be another place for the other souls. to go. So. it's
Yeah.
a place. So if Jesus came out of paradise.
well, you're asking a question that's juxtaposed to what I'm talking about, but I'll answer it. Are there more than one compartment or room in Hades, or more than one state? Yeah. Yeah, I think there is. I think we kind of touched on that with the word studies. Paradise, the Persian word for that sort of enclosed palace garden, if you will, which is supposed to create a picture of Eden again, isn't it? In the reader's mind, anyway. I think that's what God was aiming at. So a restful place, yes. What about others? Is everyone in paradise? I don't think so. But if we look at it as a state of existence of the soul, as opposed to a place, I think that's what we need to get to.
Okay,
Yeah.
you said, I'll say it again, you don't think everybody's in paradise. Do you think everybody's in Hades?
Well, I think paradise is probably a part of Hades. But if it's a state, we've got to get out of our human way of thinking that, it's a place with a label on the door, and, if we leave the cemetery, it says Hades, 100 miles that way, or that way. We've got to stop thinking like that, okay? Because the spiritual is not constrained by those things that the physical is. Yeah.
It's a bit like today, we're part of the kingdom,
Uh-huh.
but the kingdom isn't a place.
Ah.
Uh-huh.
What is the kingdom?
Well, it's a relationship. It is a state.
Mhm.
When we worship God, it's a state. It's
Right.
not a building. It's souls that
Right.
are united together, coming before God.
Yeah.
And so it's a state. We're in a state today.
Mhm.
You can't find the soul.
Right.
Even in
So,
a physical state, two people can sit beside each other.
well,
And one person could be at peace and the other one not, even in a physical state.
In a physical state, yeah. Well, yeah, I don't disagree with you, but
I want to keep this focused on what we're talking about. That after the death of the physical body, the soul is taken, and God has control over that. Okay, it'd be another way of saying it would be, and God is keeping the souls of the dead until the judgment.
Well, I think it's like you said a while ago. Some souls, they're all the souls are asleep that are already gone.
Right.
Some are at restful sleep. and
Yeah.
Some are not.
Some are not. Okay.
Wherever that is.
This will make sense more when we get to the
Yeah.
parable that you're all itching for me to get to.
That's-
Well, no, that makes more sense to me.
Yeah.
I mean, it's everybody's soul is asleep, you know,
Mhm.
But some are restful and some are not restful.
Some
depending
sleep
on-
is fitful, isn't it? Yeah. I all of what I'm doing so far, all the classes, I'm taking time to go into every aspect because I'm building up towards this pivotal parable that we're going to get to, the rich man and Lazarus, okay? If I'd have just jumped straight into it, it would have been a waste of time for me to try and teach you anything, okay? Because I've got to approach it with the full gamut of what the Bible says about death and the afterlife. Because then when we see Jesus's parable, and when we see it in the context in which I believe he meant it, we'll see that he wasn't giving a class on the afterlife. That wasn't what his purpose was. His purpose was to get the attention of a specific part of his audience. And all that began right the way back in chapter 13. And everything he taught in parables from chapter 13, verse 22, all the way through to 16, 18 was to do with the same thing. It was building to the same thing. It was tackling the sins, if you will, of the Pharisees. Okay, he knew that they were in his audience. Okay, sometimes they engaged him directly, other times not. Other times they ridiculed him, but all of his messages, even the parable of the lost son, the prodigal son, directed definitely at the Pharisees. Okay, who's the older brother in that parable? Okay, so I think the context is very, very important, and I think what we've been guilty of is we just jump straight into that parable and take out of it what we want, and we've totally missed the context because it's a story, and maybe because it's got real characters' names. If you have a Catholic Bible, you'll see the name. The rich man's not the rich man; he's called Divus, okay, which is the Latin for rich. They've taken license there, but then they've got Lazarus. Does anyone know what Lazarus means? I mean, if I give you a clue, it's a transliteration to the Greek from the Hebrew word name Eleazar. Do you know what the word Eleazar means? It means, huh?
Tell us.
Tell us. It means only God can help.
Huh.
That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because what's the state of that guy in the story? Well, he's laying at the gates of the rich man and he's been left there and the dogs are licking his sores. And is anybody helping him? No, only God can help him. And he does, doesn't he? Because when he dies, what do we read? God sends his angels take him to the side of Abraham there, where he is able to find rest. So there's a context, okay? Who's the rich man in the parable?
Davis.
Yeah,
Davis. Deviant Davis.
but it's the Pharisees, isn't it? Yeah, they like to live sumptuously, don't they? They love amassing wealth. They also like having the popularity stakes, don't they, and all the rest of it. And Jesus is very critical of that, isn't he? So, without saying any more on that, we'll come back to that next time. Man's clearly not an animal. You know, if Lazarus, the Lazarus in John chapter 11,
Jesus's friend. If Lazarus had been dead for some 4 days, why do we never hear anything from Lazarus about what happened?
We gotta wait till we get to heaven to find out.
Believe me, when you get to heaven, that's going to be the furthest thing from your mind.
Will we recognize our loved ones in heaven?
Ooh,
That's a good question.
that class is in next quarter.
Because I always imagine finding my parents and my sisters.
It's true, but it won't matter.
Right.
If there's no sadness.
But
or
who
something,
you-
won't-
But who are you marrying?
You're not married.
Who are you marrying?
You are married.
Who's the church marrying?
Jesus.
Jesus. Where's Jesus? At the right hand of God. So where's our focus?
Oh, God.
On God. Believe you me, all these things are not going to be important in the spiritual. Okay. Will we feel loss or anything like that? No, because we'll know that our loved ones are there with us. He'll account for that somehow. Whatever he needs to do, he's got all that taken care of.
Even if your loved ones are not with you, you're not gonna. you're
No.
not gonna worry about that.
No, because, and that really enters another subject, which I could teach a quarter on that as well. But what's one of the characteristics of God? It begins with a J.
Jesus.
He's just, isn't he? God is absolutely just in all that he does. Amen. On the judgment day, barring people like Satan, possibly, not a person, is everyone going to leave the judgment knowing that they've received justice from a just God who's going to right all wrongs? Do you believe that? I have to believe that. So if God's going to right all wrongs, even though some people are going to leave God's presence forever because they didn't choose relationship or covenant with him, they will accept and realize that they've received justice, not injustice. I think that's part of the righting of all wrongs and the renewing of all things. Okay. At least that has to be my understanding. That's where I am in my understanding of God's characteristic of his deity, because otherwise he's not just. Does that make sense? That's where I'm at with that. So there won't be anyone leaving the judgment feeling that they've been hard done by. I know we kind of say that, it sort of not seriously sometimes, but that's my take on it. They won't have any beef with God. Okay. Will they want to be able to go back and redo things and do it a different way? Yeah, probably. I imagine so. But they won't feel that they've been given a hard deal. That I believe that, because I believe God is just. Does that make sense? And this is deep stuff. We're getting into some, I'm down that far into the state now. This is good.
I think also with the justice, sometimes we feel guilty if, none of our family, we don't have one family member that's a Christian.
We do. We have a daughter.
Yeah, except for Jessica. But, I know myself, like through life, you can start to feel guilty that you didn't do enough, or you didn't say the right thing at the right time, or you didn't do this, or you didn't do that. But I think part of justice is that no matter how imperfect we are, God always fills the gap. So he's not going to let someone go to hell if he knows that in a different circumstance with a different person, they would have gone to heaven. We don't have to feel guilty because God is ultimately in control.
Yeah.
And he doesn't expect us to have it all on our shoulders. But it took me a long time to realize that.
Reconcile
Yeah, reconcile it.
that. Yeah, but it's important to get there, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
But, I mean, that's a really interesting area of study on its own. But anyway, forgot where I got in there. Everyone having fun?
Yeah.
Yes. It's pretty clear to me that Lazarus had no recollection of what happened the minute he stopped breathing. Okay, in John 11. He doesn't know anything about being put in the tomb and his body being prepared in the Jewish tradition. He's certainly not aware of his funeral. He's not aware of anything he did when his soul departed to Hades. And it was there some 3-4 days before Jesus summoned the soul back to his body and made him as he had been before he died, without the disease.
Mr. Smith?
Yes. I was wondering when I might get a question from that corner of the room.
Fill us in a little bit on the 4 days.
The 4 days.
Okay, yeah, that Lazarus was dead. Okay, it's my understanding that the Jews believe that a person's soul stayed with them for 3 days, and then on the 4th day, it left them. Is there any significance of Jesus waiting till the 4th day to bring Lazarus back?
Perhaps. You'll have to come up here and teach us on the Jewish tradition there, because I'm no wiser than you are on that. But yeah, if there was, then perhaps so. I personally believe from my study that it's more to do with when you consider the Jewish burial preparation. You know, when they buried Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, how many pounds of aloes and spices did they use? 70. I mean, that's like a big sack of cement they were carrying. And that's just the aloes. I mean, they covered his body in that deal before they wrapped him in those linen cloths. And what does that do over a period of a few days? Have you ever messed with aloe? It's kind of
start stinking too.
Well, it's going to go like glue. It's going to go like glue. That much is, with the other additives and whatever. So when he said Lazarus come out of the tomb, how do you think? Do you think Lazarus just walked out like, you know, the mummies on Scooby-Doo? Huh? I don't think so, because he was stiff as a board. Okay, I think he just came out. I don't know how he did it, levitating or whatever, but he just came out. He couldn't not come out because the I Am was speaking to him. That makes all the difference in the world. When the I Am said to Peter out on the Sea of Galilee, yeah, come. He was able to walk on the water, wasn't he? Yeah.
But I think you're also limiting the amount of, it's a miracle. So
Mhm.
therefore, when you say he can't do this, or, you know, if it was not a miracle, his skin would be deteriorated into the
Exactly.
cracks, but it was a miracle. So therefore,
Yeah.
none of those things.
Well, whatever corruption his body saw, it was righted. Jesus had the power. I mean, if he could give a man eyes who was born with no eyes, if he could cure a leper whose skin was rotting off of his body, you know, and cure him, there isn't anything that Jesus, the point of his miracles was to right the curse, wasn't it? Or cancel the curse, whichever way you want to look at it. So I see in that the 4 days, just, you know, his body should have smelled. I mean, that's what they said in the passage, isn't it? Oh, it's going to stink by now. Ooh, don't open that door. Ooh. But what's interesting to me is that there's no account of life on the other side from Lazarus. Nothing at all. Why? Because he was asleep. Okay, he wasn't conscious. The sleep of the dead. Well, I've already covered that. I'm getting off my text here. So we're about out of time. And I'm just going to finish with this here. So it's time to step back from our picture. Remember the picture we've talked about? We kind of put a frame around it now of what the afterlife is and what it isn't. And we've tried to give some clarity. So we've got a kind of a picture there. It's real fuzzy still in a lot of areas right now, but maybe we can add the right color in the right places, okay, and continue to get a clearer picture. Despite seeing references to Sheol and Hades being described as under the earth or in the depths of the earth, we have seen that Sheol and Hades are not so much a place of the dead, but rather a state of the dead. That's what we've seen tonight. In that state, there is darkness, inactivity, stillness, unconsciousness, and sleep. Even for the wicked. We have no indication of any present punishment being taken out on them. That's different to what we did talk about, though, isn't it? The dread that they may have. But they're not being punished. No one's punished until after the judgment. You don't get punishment before the judgment because that ain't justice, is it? And we know that. So there's no torment of fire, no gnashing of teeth. There's simply the ominous gloom of death away from, as the writer of Ecclesiastes said, life under the sun. The matters we have considered in the last classes have all been aimed at preparing us to look at that pivotal parable. Weather permitting, and God permitting, we'll look at that next week in more detail. Any closing questions? Well, thank you for your questions. Thank you for your presence. We'll do it all again next week.